It's about time I came back for another countdown, and I promised I'd bring out another series I am loyal to, and that is the Final Fantasy series. Even though I'm not a die-hard fan of the RPG series, I've been hooked with this series ever since Final Fantasy IX my cousin showed me and let me play. I've been drooling over every game I've played since then. Just the music, the mechanics, the customization, it's all so great. So the question, which one do I like more than others? So here's the rules. I played 12 Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasies 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10-2, 12, 13, 13-2, and Tactics Advance on the GBA. So I thought, why not rank what I'm familiar with? So I have a huge warning is that I'm very unorthodox with what games I prefer in this series compared to everyone else in the fanbase. This is because when I pick up my video games, I play through the game myself before I learn about its popularity afterwards. Because of this, my personal opinion got to the game first before I heard good and bad about it by the whole amongst the community. Because of this, I don't have popularity bias when it comes to my personal opinion with the series. So here's my warning, and I can't stress this enough. Prepare yourself that any Final Fantasy game could appear at any time. If you seem surprised with an entry, then I will explain why it became that rank for me if you stick around for it. This is the top 12 personal Final Fantasy games, not the most popular Final Fantasy games. This is one person. I don't represent the majority of Final Fantasy players. So if you say Final Fantasy VI and VII should be number 1, then I encourage you to know the difference between personal and popularity. I am not factoring in popularity at all. With that, let's get started. Do you know what you do when you finish a game in a series? Naturally, you go out and look for more of the games from the series to try out. I'm no different with the Final Fantasy series. When I was done with the game, I hunted for my next game to try, and it just so happened that this bottom entry game happened to not work out for my personal taste, so I didn't play it as much as the others. Little did I know at the time, before the internet came out and I knew of its popularity, I had just selected the game the internet proclaims as the best Final Fantasy game of all time. So, I need to preface this a little bit. Usually when you see a countdown like this, some people might assume that number 12 is my most hated game with number 1 being the best. But it's more like this, that number 12 is my most okay-ish game, and number 1 is my favorite game I love to play. I don't hate any of the Final Fantasy games, and that includes Final Fantasy VI. I love this game too, along with the series. The Final Fantasy games don't do a single thing to make me hate any of them as a whole. Final Fantasy VI is an amazing game on so many levels. It has very solid gameplay. The progression system is very rewarding. It's not frustrating to get the hang of, and I had a blast going through the game. I truly did. If I gave this game a rating scale out of 10, it would be around a 7.5 in how much fun I had with it. Hey, 7.5 is a really good ranking for bottom entry of comparing this series as a whole. But let's question the inevitable. Why is it number 12, and why didn't it work for my personal taste compared to the others? So first, let's address the pack of elephants I'm sure Final Fantasy fans will address in defending this game with good reason. Number 1, this Super Nintendo and Final Fantasy VI is my childhood. Number 2, it is one of the most innovative RPG games around. And number 3, this game is considered number 1 everywhere. So for the first question, I didn't grow up with the Super Nintendo. I grew up with the Sega Genesis. So because of this, I'm limited in my nostalgia towards the Super Nintendo, and you'll find those Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games show up early because of that. For example, I have played Donkey Kong Country, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Super Mario World, but I have only played each of them one time, because I don't have that childhood connection to that system like I do with the Sega Genesis, simple as that. And as we know, childhood nostalgia means everything in what systems will be precious to you growing up with them. If you want proof of this, why can't we ever get over those old school systems in the year 2015? Because we have too many stinking good memories of those classic video games to hold on to. As for the second question, it may be true that Final Fantasy VI did set a lot of groundbreaking achievements in RPG standards, but I came across this game in my middle teenage years, around 14 or 15, somewhere in the PlayStation 2 era when I first played this game. So those innovative things it's doing are going to fly over my shoulders because I can't notice it because I was desensitized to the PlayStation 2 standards at the time when I played those later systems first before the Super Nintendo. Sorry, but when I came across Final Fantasy VI, to me it's frankly just as special as any other Final Fantasy game by my standards. Trust me, if we put a lot of people in front of an Atari 2600 console from 2015, it may be true it did do a lot of original and fascinating advancements in the video game industry back then, but it's not impressive to the modern gamers nowadays to catch anything of interest to get them attached to it. And so it is with me with Final Fantasy VI. Now for the last question. True, Final Fantasy VI is considered number 1 by many Final Fantasy fans, but here's the thing is that I got to play this game before I heard of the game's popularity because I never checked popularity behind video games normally in real life, and only found out about it several years later when the internet became prominent. This means that I can determine for myself when I play the game myself how fun of a game it's going to be for me personally. So when I heard of this game's popularity eventually, I don't need any secondhand opinions about this game when I played it personally. Other people can't determine how I get my fun from video games, pure and simple. I think that's it for the questions, and I can't talk about everything with Final Fantasy VI, otherwise it'll be a really long while. So I'll stick to what made it number 12 for me and leave it at that. But keep this in mind, Final Fantasy VI has plenty of positives that kept me playing it for a long while, and I enjoyed myself. But these reasons kind of bored me out of it about 75% through the game and I lost my interest. So going back to my Sega Genesis roots, I love when the music gets fast-paced and gritty. However, with this on the Super Nintendo, it's no secret that it has an entirely different direction from those music preferences I grew attached to from the Genesis. And admittedly, a good part of it is also the instruments they chose in Final Fantasy VI specifically, where I don't like it so much as well, which is what put Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy V higher. I don't really prefer these graphics from the Super Nintendo. I prefer the colorful and bright graphics that Final Fantasy IV and V had rather than the detailed and realistic tone from the game. Now I could blame the Sega Genesis for this, and I could put part of the blame for that because I won't automatically forgive it because it's not my childhood system. It's more detailed, but at the cost of not looking so clean and consistent because it doesn't have those colors to pop those details out, and I personally don't like that. So because of the music and graphics in this game, the game doesn't feel as energetic as the rest of the series for me personally over time, and after a while, I very slowly started to lose interest in it and got bored of it entirely. It is not a bad game at all, it has no problems, and it's a very solid game. Just one that happened to be not up my alley, and that's it. There are a few things I could cover with the game specifically, but we're in a countdown, not a full-blown review, so sorry I couldn't cover everything. I just happened to grow up with a different system and came across it at a later part in life. So my nostalgia potential has been shot to snot in having those strong connections everyone has with the game, and that's really it. So after I played Final Fantasy IX from my cousin, my first Final Fantasy game, I bought Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX for the PlayStation 1. It's the next step to explore the other games on the same console, so I 100%ed Final Fantasy IX. I was full of nostalgia and energy ready to tackle my next Final Fantasy. Some recommended number 8 to me at the time, and I had a blast with it for my second Final Fantasy game, but I got stuck around 90% of the game because I used GFs the whole time to break the game, but that can only work for so long until you play it properly, so I decided to come back to it later. So, all that's left is Final Fantasy VII. So I rewrote the script to this about 5 times. Yes, you heard me, 5 times, and it took me a week just for this one entry. Can you imagine a long controversial entry like this plus rewriting the script 5 times? It took forever. So I have this problem is that I'm a really respectful person, but I'm also a hardcore realist, which means I was trying over and over and over again to be respectful to the Final Fantasy VII players and bringing up my reasons for this being the number 11 entry. So I told myself I'd be able to do it somehow, but every time something slipped into my script that a Final Fantasy VII player was going to nitpick out of me, and it wasn't good enough. How was I going to be respectful? So after 5 times on the script, my hardcore realist side told me something. Feelings are going to get hurt. Some people will nitpick the hell out of anything I say anyways, just simply because Final Fantasy VII is at number 11, and I should accept that some people simply like hating things and hating other people's opinions. But I should warn that I can't phrase my words in a way in this entry to be fluffy Cloudland, being at the number 11 spot. And you know what? I'm showing my true colors and honesty to the very end. So let's set up Final Fantasy VII and when I played it at the first time at around 12 to 13 years old. Number 1, this is the 3rd Final Fantasy game I've played, so I'm primed with Final Fantasy nostalgia to like it. Number 2, I have played numerous RPGs at this point and I cherish them. Number 3, I didn't own the internet, so I had no idea how popular it was. And number 4, I played this game for 6 hours on my first playthrough to try it out. The final verdict? It isn't at all a bad game. There was nothing wrong with it mechanics wise. Now comes the death sentence. Final Fantasy VII is honestly one of the most boring RPG games I have ever played. I'll give you my 3 main reasons why. Reason number 1. Nothing new or spontaneous is introduced after the materia system is introduced about an hour into the game. Usually in RPGs, new mechanics or spontaneous things happen in RPGs to mix them up, like new abilities or some type of progression. For example, with Pokemon Red and Blue, new abilities and new Pokemon add some variety to the battles consistently. Final Fantasy VIII had a draw system to try out new magic to experiment in junction with, along with the new GFs coming in from different places to keep it interesting throughout the game. Final Fantasy X is consistently bringing up tutorials to introduce new mechanics. Even Final Fantasy XIII has plenty of new content with its Paradigm and Crystarium systems to keep the game fresh to introduce often. With Final Fantasy VII, after this moment of latching on the materia the first time, what more needs to be done to customize your equipment? Nothing. Are there any abilities coming in quick after Fire, Ice, Lightning, and Cure? Nope. You're stuck with those abilities for a stinking long time with no new ones coming in soon. So the game effectively only uses 2 tactics for the first 6 hours that I played it. Number 1, spam your attack in Fire, Ice, or Lightning. And number 2, use Cure as needed. You don't need any other abilities, and you don't need new abilities because the strategy is very simple to kill every enemy on screen with simple brute force. That's a game breaker for me in an RPG, that abilities are so sparse to learn in this game early on, and no new mechanics to show for it. It's frankly very disappointing to look at. Reason number 2, I know that stories are subjective from person to person, but this story frankly didn't have any high points for me. While Final Fantasy VII viewers will insist that I'm wrong and label me that I didn't try hard enough to understand things, I just honestly couldn't be bothered with it, and it's not up my alley to have any interest for it for me personally. When I was 12, and even then for today when I went through the game, nothing stands out to make me pay attention to it. It's not a bad story, just one that wasn't a topic of mine I happened to find an interest in. You guys don't need a lecture about how personal tastes go. You know how it works. There's simply stories I like in media, there are stories I don't care about in media, and stories I could outright hate on in media. Naturally, what I prefer and what you prefer are completely different things. It doesn't need to be complicated. Reason number 3. When I play new video games, I usually try them out for around 6 hours to see if the game is for me. So when I played Final Fantasy VII for these 6 hours, my first time, this is what happened. I enjoyed myself for the first hour and in learning the materia system. Around 2 hours, I was waiting for the game to introduce something new to the gameplay, and I held on to that thought, having faith in that, because it was a Final Fantasy game. Hour 3. Disappointed, but had faith. Hour 4 is when I started considering that I wasted money on the game. Hour 5. Hour 6. When I left Midgar, I said, that's it. You had 6 hours, I'm done with you. It's obvious since Final Fantasy VII is an RPG game that it will pick up its momentum eventually, as the fans will continually keep telling me is there. But having to wait 6 hours is about as stretching it as it can get to get an RPG going. And frankly to me, it deserves every single nail it gets from me to cement it to the number 11 spot. This is my most disappointing Final Fantasy game to date, as in I had these high expectations and I was absolutely certain that it was going to deliver on every front. So obviously it decided to go meh on every bullet point. So what is this mystery Final Fantasy game? I'll give you a hint. It's a sequel. As you've guessed, this is the sequel to Final Fantasy X. It follows Yuna in her everyday life as a spear hunter while she's traveling through Spira, but keeping in the back of her mind how to get Tidus back and how she misses him. But let's talk about the premise, about the 3 girls you control as party members throughout the adventure. They're fine. I don't mind an all-female cast in a Final Fantasy game or anything they're doing to function like that in a video game. Girls have every right to be whatever they like to be in video games, just like men do. But I do have a concern about a lot of other things. Well, first the story. In my opinion, it doesn't really work. Since Yuna is a spear hunter and moving all around Spira, she has the opportunity to be a part of missions and add a storyline to each area she goes to with different results depending on what you do over the course of the game. While I admit it's fun to follow through with these stories to the end, drifting the story away from the main story and the three characters is not one I favor too much. And the other thing is that each mission feels more like a minigame rather than sticking to the main story like a Final Fantasy game usually does. Chasing chocobos, giving away tickets, and the blitzball was a complete gag compared to the first game. About controlling 3 party members, I kind of agree you should only have 3 because the job change system in this game is rather expansive. But here's the complaint I have about the job system this time around. In my opinion, it's broken. If you only want to complete the main story to this game, it doesn't take a lot of thought in what jobs you should be, which downgrades the game's strategy amount a great deal. Which brings me to the game's padding. Unlike other Final Fantasies, this game is extremely short, broken up into 5 small chapters. The appeal to this game is to do it over and over again using a 100% completion bar to find special items or activate certain events to increase the percentage rate on every playthrough a little bit. But in my opinion, this isn't really a big incentive to play the game over and over again for those small things, if the main meat of the game is a problem. And what is that problem? A big thing about Final Fantasies and its lasting value is rewards or accomplishments to keep the journey going, at which I have to admit this game has plenty of, like in finding new job classes or finding certain events like a secret ending to this game, but in the long run it isn't worth it in my opinion because the game doesn't encourage too much incentive to keep going with the job system, which is its main focus. I don't feel rewarded or feel like I'm accomplishing anything when I'm trying out new jobs or getting their abilities because I don't need them for anything or it doesn't give any reward for doing them, so why do them? In short, this is the game in my opinion that had the most untapped potential. The gameplay is awesome, the job system is marvelous, but because it has that big problem like that short length of the game to really flesh any of the potential out, I was expecting a lot out of it. It's honestly a very disappointing game. I played this game through about 5 times and have tried to root out everything I could and I think I got around 93%. It's the Final Fantasy I feel least accomplished on compared to any other Final Fantasy out there, and that's truly a bummer. There could have been so much more to this game, it's not even funny. Remember me saying that the Super Nintendo wasn't for me? Well, the other 2 entries are closer than you think. I'll say it once, and I'll say it again. Now, a lot of people, when they see Final Fantasy IV at number 9, you might be assuming I'm bashing the game. But no, every Final Fantasy game from this point onwards are the ones I absolutely love and adore. This is the part where I don't like ranking Final Fantasy games because they're all fantastically crafted games, so I love every one of these 9 entries onward a lot. And if you still think I'm dissing this game or any of them past this point, then that's your thoughts, not mine. With that, let's start with the greatest character development in video games in my opinion, Cecil Harvey. Within the first hour, this game just rakes it into it faster than any other Final Fantasy game because of its story. Oh my gosh, the story is perfect in its pacing and possibly the best in my opinion, especially when it comes to a specific character. It starts off awesome and continually keeps getting awesome after that. I can't put down the controller. I have to know what happens next. What's going to come next? I have to know. Plus it helps that the other characters have their own backstories to keep the story rolling forward really well. Along with the unbelievable story, the gameplay is very solid, very fluid, and very energetic. What I like about this Final Fantasy game in particular is that it's like Final Fantasies 9 and 10. Each character has their strengths, weaknesses, and their own abilities they learn on their own over time. This is what also made the game very appealing from the get-go. Watching the young Rydia level up quick to start learning some black magic, and then when other characters come in like Rosa's white magic, the game gets really progressive and really fun, really quick. No party member is ever left out. You need them all. Well, except for Edward. I personally didn't like him too much. However, there are 3 things that drop this game in ranks for me despite its brilliant execution. It's a Super Nintendo game, which from my Sega Genesis rant and to my own dismay, my nostalgia is limited a little bit. The second thing is that the story got weird with one thing, is that there are all of these characters that supposedly died throughout the story, I think 4 or 5 of them, but that they miraculously come back to life sometime later in the game kind of takes away a lot of the seriousness of those moments in the story when those appear by one of the worst ways I've ever seen in a Final Fantasy game for me personally. Playing April Fools with character deaths is honestly a very stupid thing to do. The last thing is that this game has some random moments in it that really tick me off. First, do you remember that story where metal becomes heavy? Well, I went through that entire cavern, but I forgot to talk to Edward, and this is important because you have to talk to Edward in order to beat a boss in this cavern. And then one look at a strategy guide later, I had to manually walk all the way out of the cavern to take care of that horrible problem in the game itself didn't tell me about. Second, remember the Magus sisters in that ship? That section of the game was a point of no return moment in the game, so I couldn't go outside and do other things to prepare myself at all. So I had to restart my game to prepare for them, which sucked! Third, when you get to the moon, where do I go now? And I got stuck at this moment for a very long time. Sorry, but this game put me through quite a few playthroughs just to get past some of its tedious moments, so that's why I got a little lower than the others. Still an awesome game, but it had its moments to kick me in the butt sometimes. You all know which game is coming next. And you know why it's my favorite Super Nintendo Final Fantasy game? Customization. I'm a sucker for customization and I need some consistently to enjoy an RPG. And Final Fantasy V delivers the whole goods better than a lot of other Final Fantasy titles out there on that front. This is hands down the most ignored game in the series. I've never heard anyone talk about it except just to chew out X-Death, but otherwise, it's a simple memory that's passed on and by for most players, and I can see why. Final Fantasy V doesn't really have any wow factors. It's not an impressive story, it's a straightforward experience with no memorable moments, and the strategy and premise of the game is about as simple as it can get. But you know what? I love it anyways despite those flaws. As mentioned just now, the customization on your jobs and abilities is the star of the show in this game. Now I know it isn't that impressive because each character doesn't stand out in certain abilities and that this can get broken easily if you know how to use it properly. But hear me out. I played through this game twice, and it was absolutely elating playing this game because I don't know how to break it or know that certain job class that will wipe the floor with every battle. I said earlier that I wasn't a hardcore fan of the series, so look at where we stand. I had so much fun customizing and experimenting with so many playstyles and strategies with the mixing and matching to find out which strategies worked for me in different certain situations. Every time I got a game over in this game, instead of being discouraged, I felt my puzzle fire start to blossom up ravagely in my gamer spirit. It was an absolute beast of satisfaction to find out which abilities and strategies worked with what throughout the entire game, and I had so much fun with it, it's criminal. Now there isn't really much else to really compliment this game for, but I want to stress that one powerful positive was what tied me to this game and made it my favorite Super Nintendo game out of the three. Grinding wasn't a drag because you were learning abilities often. The enemies and bosses were really enjoyable. Just everything in the gameplay department nailed it right to my number 8 spot. Obviously, because the story, it was good, but it wasn't spectacular, and I liked those wow moments that further Final Fantasy games had. But I don't regret playing this game for a second. It was an engaging experience from start to finish the whole time. Here comes the bias. Because I'm a die-hard fan of the Legend of Zelda series, this Final Fantasy game sort of wonders because in my opinion, it is the most explorative and non-linear game in the series. So, I know a lot of people have gripes with the Final Fantasy XIII series of games, and those reasons are perfectly legit. But since it's more addressed with the original, number 13 itself, I'll come back to those complaints and explain them then. Until then, let's talk about what makes 13.2 different from the original. Unlike 10 when it transferred to 10.2, when 13 went to 13.2, the game is much longer, and a lot more of it is thought out because of the possible exploration and heights of trial and error. But I'm really glad it decided to go with its own identity, but keeping to what worked with Final Fantasy XIII at the same time. And for that, it gets a lot of praise from me on that front. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is the top of the class in being the most explorative game in the series, hands down. The very moment you pick up the controller and about an hour into this game becomes a Legend of Zelda game about as expansive as the NES version. And you probably think I'm kidding, but I'm not. This game has so many random locations and random items and random content with little indications on where any of it is, it's not close to being funny. You will get lost in this game a lot without a strategy guide. Thankfully there are little breadcrumbs around, unlike the NES Legend of Zelda game, which I appreciate a lot to make the game very enjoyable. To explain what's happening is that you go back and forth through time to different timelines and experience the world in different places and in different years, changing settings and objectives all the time. I'm starting to realize this is something very complicated to explain, So I say to look into this game because it'll be too much to explain in a countdown. Now to talk about the downside, thankfully unlike Final Fantasy VIII, it's a lot easier to pick up on the mechanics, and you don't have to restart your game because instead, like Final Fantasy V, you can customize and work with the situation to get back on track. But the battle system has lost its structure slightly from the original. The only thing I wish is that there are 3 permanent party members like it did with X-II, but instead you're with 2 party members and a monster buddy, which makes the formation mechanic a little disappointing, since you'll be spamming the Commander and Ravager classes a lot because of this with Noah and Sarah. I appreciate the monster buddy, but it still feels disappointing to only have 2 permanent party members in the game. Plus it leaves a lot of wanting more character development with a lot more party members to come in to fill in those gaps. 2 could have been better with a 3rd member to come in my opinion. As for everything else, I loved it all. The varying objectives, the changing strategies, the fast-paced gameplay we'll cover in the original later on, the story plots as they changed here and there in the timelines because I'm a sucker for the Oracle of Ages from The Legend of Zelda, the massive amount of exploration and mystery to the game, the characters were decent and weren't distracting, and overall, I know not a lot are a fan of these games, but I loved it dearly and genuinely enjoyed the entire experience. This Final Fantasy game has the best music in the series, and boy do I love me some good music from video games when it nails it perfectly as it did here. I listen to the soundtrack all the time and it never, ever gets old.
Hit me with all you got, Dad!
It's Final Fantasy VIII. If there's a Final Fantasy game that pumps me up for a battle more than any other battle, it's this one. Every time a boss battle comes up, every time a cutscene comes up, and every time you fight Sorceress Edea or Ultimecia, a magical sparkle of nostalgia starts billowing and running over my nostalgia cup, and I still want more of it. Yes, yes, yes! Okay, I'm calming down, but music is one of the best connections a video game can offer to emphasize having a good time with the game, and this game gets an A+ mark from me for the music department. Now obviously you probably noticed the number 6 position and you're thinking, you must have a catch somewhere to drag this game back down. And unfortunately this negative I'm about to cover is about as bad as it is how much I praise the music for, which is why this entry is hovering in the middle of the list. The huge positive is balanced out with a huge negative. Let's just get it out there. The learning curve in this game is the worst in the series. There, I said it. Obviously I've been able to overcome these problems over time, but if you don't keep an eye on yourself like I didn't do with Final Fantasy VIII, you'll get into a deep sludge of trouble so bad you'd have to restart the game, which I've had to do a few times. First, the tutorials and learning how to do things like improving stats with the draw system. It's not learning this that's the problem, it just takes so long to draw the magic you need for monsters to improve the stats you need, and it takes forever. It's not fun, it's stupid and repetitive. Second, and this one made me restart the game the first time, you have to watch out for GFs you need to extract from bosses. GFs are summons you get in this game, and they make your party more powerful and more available for stat boosts. The more you get, the better, but if you neglect to get them from bosses or keep a lookout for them and get them, your game is screwed. Simple as that. Because once you pass those bosses without getting them, there's no way you're getting them after that. Of course there's Ultimecia's castle where you can get them again, but if you miss too many of them, the threshold of impossibility to get there goes higher and higher the more you miss. And well, for a first time player, would you know all this to prepare for it? Not likely unless you heard about it, which equals trouble to adapt to the game. The last thing is that you can break this game only using GFs, which I did my first couple of times. Your GFs do massive damage in combat and you can spam them without needing any other strategy, encouraging the player to ignore the annoying learning curves because they're hard to get accustomed to and keep spamming GFs. However, because I encountered a boss at the end of Disc 3 that negated using GFs as a proper strategy, I've had to restart the game and incorporate magic and abilities along with GFs. Everything else checks out. The characters are good, the enemies and bosses are a thrill to fight, and the energy to keep going is very real, especially with the music. But I can't deny that this game has some serious problems with getting accustomed to the mechanics, dragging it down pretty far. My advice? Buy a strategy guide if you buy this game the first couple of times. It is not player friendly compared to the rest of the series. Again, my cousin introduced me to this game along with Final Fantasy IX, and guess how many hours he put into the game? 130 hours. At first I was like, no freaking way. And then I played the game, and I ended up doing the same thing. This game is legendary and made by RPG gods to explore every conceivable corner possible. It's Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. The Tactics Advance from the Final Fantasy series is a spin-off series from the usual line up in rows and wait for your turn to attack. What the Tactics games do is place your characters on a grid-like environment, and it has an incredible depth to its system the very moment you pick up the controller and start playing this game. The tutorials are extremely short, it encourages so much customization from the get-go, and compounds it into your own unique experience. There are so many things to do in this game, so many missions, so many items, so many spells. It's like the Skyrim of Final Fantasy games. There's no end to it, and it's incredibly addictive. As I said, 130 hours, and it was worth every minute of fun. What I also love about this game is that it has a grand mixture of storytelling and running off and wanting to go and do your own thing. For example, every time you pick missions, you never know if it's going to be tied into the main story or not, but it adds enough story as an incentive as you go along that you feel the progress becoming very real, both on that front and keeping in touch with your characters as you level them up. The battle system is spectacular and extremely unforgettable to get involved in, and it has stuff to keep you on edge and to keep the difficulty consistent and fair, and it varies from scenario to scenario the problems you'll run into. For example, one time you have to do an 8 versus 12 battle, another time you have to destroy objects instead of killing the monsters, and overall the variety is constantly present from battle to battle, which is what gives this game its unbelievable charm. Are there downsides? Yes, but they're minor and they're actually easy to get around, but they're still annoyances, so I should bring them up. I hate the territory war in this game, so I avoid participating in it because the game becomes unmanageable having to watch over each territory constantly. If you don't do it, then you don't get good deals with items and weapons, but the trade-off wasn't worth it and I had enough money anyways to manage without those deals. Oh yeah, there are laws in this game, meaning there are certain things you're not allowed to do or else that character goes to jail. As the game goes far into it, more laws are added to each battle, and some can get annoying if you don't keep on top of tracking them. Like for example that there's a law where you can't use physical attacks. Once in a while there's a law that slips in there that you're not prepared for, and it gets annoying having to work around some of them on the fly. Otherwise, fantastic game. Everyone check it out. I recommend it to everyone who loves the Final Fantasy series, and it's not one you should not miss out on at all for an instant. I love Blitzball. I adore Blitzball. I worship Blitzball. Why can't this be a sport in real life? I'm so jealous. The amount of time I spent on this minigame is engrossingly high, and I have a ridiculous amount of fun doing my share of it every time I boot up a new save file. Oh, yeah, right. I'm in a countdown. Anyways. What I prize Final Fantasy X for is its simplicity compared to the rest of the series. Simple story to follow, simple customization, and simple fun. Now you might think that I might be criticizing the game in that manner, but instead I'm praising it the same reason that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is popular. Isn't Ocarina of Time so loved because anybody could pick it up and play it? Admit it, the charm and the nostalgia are the strongest points of this game, and just that alone sucks all of us into that experience. The attachment to the overall experience is simply too great to pass this one up. However, because the game is so simple, there's not really a lot to talk about with it since there aren't really too many complex things to expand on. Just play the game, drink in the story, rock out to the music, and just have a good time, and that's all there is to it. I think that's what makes Final Fantasy X the best of the series in my opinion on this point. It's extremely user-friendly to make it easier for newer players, but at the same time, it contains plenty of other content and options just like the other Final Fantasies if you want to go the whole 9 yards in experimenting with what is available to you. So if you happen to be a hardcore player and want to 100% it, there's plenty of stuff around to do if you want to go past the main story. And now to this point. And now, why isn't this game number 1 in my books? Frankly, while I appreciate the massive positives this game has to make it number 4, the game is perhaps too simple for my taste and lacks those interesting flavors a lot of the other games had. For example, the game lacks an overworld, and because of this game is pretty much a point A to point B game because of it playing through the main story. So it's very limited on area exploration and the branching paths are very few, and confined to their own areas, so like that matters. Just walk to an end of an area following the red arrow and you're done, and it's frankly done this way to keep the story continuously flowing. It's not just the simple exploration, everything else is more basic as well. The customization isn't complex, and it doesn't vary too much from one playthrough to the next, since everyone has their chosen path to follow in a straight line. The strategies are straightforward, there isn't much to this game that will potentially surprise you in its gameplay, and wake up your brain on things that are happening, and just various other things. To put a bow on the entry and keep it simple, simplicity is not the number one choice I would make to make it my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time. I think this game has an awesome story, out of this world nostalgia, overwhelmingly solid mechanics, but because the gameplay department is more adapted to newer players rather than for me that have played several RPGs and want more complicated things to play with in my toys, it's my number 4 game. Remember what I said at the beginning of this countdown, which means I know you could have intentions to share your opinion with me about this game and where you definitely want me to put this game on the list. But remember that you're in my personal interpretation of the game. This means I'm not factoring in what the general consensus of this game is as a whole amongst the Final Fantasy players. This isn't an exception even for Final Fantasy XIII. Okay, now that we had that preface out of the way, let's get started. But first, let's address the complaints some do have about Final Fantasy XIII, and it's important to go over them first for a base point. I'm going to put this bluntly, but they don't faze me at all. I've simply played too many RPGs where the game happens to do stuff I don't mind doing that. None of them are a problem for me, and they don't make me bat an eye. About the game being a hallway, I have played plenty of dungeon crawler RPGs that have done that since the 90s. I guess it makes sense that some would have a complaint about this since dungeon crawlers aren't really the rage nowadays. About the game playing itself, at which critics are talking about the long cutscene times, that's another valid complaint since gamers really do want to play their game instead of watching a movie. But I don't care about cutscenes at all. I like movies just as much as video games, so that's not something that bothers me personally. If I quote unquote watched Heavy Rain and Metal Gear Solid 4, which are the king of cutscenes, and I really enjoyed them, that's my side on the issue. I don't have time to go over other issues, but just picture your complaint you want to ask on what view I have on it, and just take my word that I don't have a problem with it. So with that, let's head into what made this game number 3 for me. Reason number 1, you have no idea how much fast games make me happy. This game is fast in its battles, blazing fast, which fires up my Grandia, Tales of Symphonia, and the Star Ocean series nostalgia all over this game. Because the game is so stinking fast, just like those other RPG games, the strategies and tense moments in this game fly all over the place in the battles in a blink of an eye, and the pressure gets very real to keep your characters alive. What's surprising about Final Fantasy XIII that makes it extremely enjoyable is that you never know what strategies your enemies are going to pull off on your characters to make you adjust to the circumstances. There's no way around it. You will get game overs in this game your first time because of a sudden strategy an enemy pulled out of their bag to wipe your party clean off your feet. The awesome news about this with Final Fantasy XIII with its game overs is that it literally places you a few steps away from the source that gave you your game over, instead of the save station, encouraging you to rethink your strategy to start again, which is a very welcome feature. Reason number 2, I love how many mechanics this game compounds into this game over time better than any other Final Fantasy game in my opinion. I'm going to tell you the 4 steps that keeps Final Fantasy XIII very fresh in its gameplay to keep the momentum rolling. Step number 1, the game teaches you a new mechanic in the paradigm system or about something else, like for example, teaching you to avoid certain monsters if they look too powerful. Step number 2, adjust the new strategy to the next set of monsters, starting with some basic ones to the more advanced ones to keep testing you on this new strategy. Step number 3, do this for the next half an hour to an hour. And step number 4, change party members and or introduce a new mechanic and start over. With this system, the game becomes much more complex and a lot more fun to get into the longer you play it. So when you learn the 6 paradigm rules, Commando, Ravager, Sentinel, Synergist, Saboteur, and Medic, and then get accustomed to their combinations to fit your playstyle, then it ramps the game into unbelievable realms of fun when 3 party members come in with a limitless amount of combinations and strategies you can bring to your characters with the paradigm system, shooting the customization and strategy aspects of this game consistently to the stars. Reason number 3, and I know I'm going to get shot for this, but this is my favorite set of characters from the series. What makes a character ideal for me to get into is that 1, they speak up often, 2, the person distinguishes him or herself strongly with his or her personality, 3, has a past he or she talks about, 4, how he or she copes with that past problem, and 5, He or she is really down to earth rather than speaking just to impress the audience's expectations. To keep things short because of time, and sorry that I can't expand on this more because of this, it kills me to leave out on what I could expand on about this to help you understand more. But all 6 of these characters really nailed it for my personal taste, and I'll leave it at that. And besides, I can't choose what I naturally like in my video games despite popularity. And frankly, these are the best ones for me to get involved with. Overall, Final Fantasy XIII, I think it's one of those games where you have to have a very specific history and preferences with video games to really get the full experience out of it. And I do agree that it does do a lot of things that could potentially bug Final Fantasy players, but luck would have it, I happen to be one of those rare guys where it happened to hit all of my sweet spots, or things I happen to not mind in video games at all. And it's as simple as that. I truly think that whatever first game you play in a series will set your nostalgia standard and set it up strong. Because it got you into the series, you have a lot to owe the game for in bringing you that first flare of excitement it brought you to start playing the series. You can't play a series without playing the first game. And my first game is Final Fantasy IX. I don't have to make a strong case of why I naturally like this game. My nostalgia will dictate for me to love the game automatically already, just from that alone with it being my first game. And you know that feeling where objective reasoning doesn't stand a chance to convince you otherwise. Ask yourself, think of your first Final Fantasy game. Just start thinking of it and you don't need words to love it. You love it unconditionally. But I guess for the sake of being taken seriously, I'd better back up and defend that nostalgia with something we could all possibly relate to with how this game is executed. And my answer is, I don't remember exactly. I was 12 years old when I first played the game. That was almost 15 years ago. But if it's a game I played religiously until the game was done to 100% completion back then, I'm talking beating the main story, I'm talking completing the entire Chocobo side quest, I'm talking about getting the Ultima weapon, which is the strongest weapon in the game for Zidane, then it's darn certain that the game was clicking with me with every single aspect of it at the time as it does today. I think that's the perfect way to sum up Final Fantasy IX and what got me into the series when my cousin showed me this game. I never thought to myself that this was ever a bad game in any respect. I just kept playing it and playing it and playing it some more, and I couldn't stop playing it. My controller and my hands never went apart, and I kept playing. There were moments since I was 12 years old that I couldn't get a firm grasp on the customization of the game, so I've had to restart it a couple of times. But that wasn't the game's fault, that was my fault. So I restarted the game and tried again. But I wasn't mad about it, because the game was so good that I didn't mind experiencing it again. So I guess in short, if you're curious about anything that this game does and whether I like every concept going on, I guess my answer is yes, I did. Or if it happened to be a tiny annoyance, it didn't do anything to shake my mind from the overall experience. Everything got flushed out to the max level. The strong music, the character development, the brilliant pace, the plentiful side quests, the ongoing customization, the brilliant late PS1 graphics, the exploration is beautifully crafted, the twists in the story along with the game's execution, the fact you get 4 party members, which doesn't happen often, the differing strategies, the enemies, the bosses, the entire game carried an identity to its own where I had no doubt that the developers put a ton of effort into every corner of this project, and it worked to everything that my personal taste could attach to. Now that's an accomplishment. Now, after all that, what could possibly top that? What could possibly beat my nostalgic behemoth in the series? I'm not going to lie, I was very skeptical of Final Fantasy XII when it first came out, and I started playing it. This was because the world was so massive it was hard to get a grasp of the structure for the game. For example, that you had to buy Cure at the store for your party members to use, and you had to unlock it individually for Vaughn, who was your starting character. I have to admit this game stumped me so bad with its first impressions, I couldn't get past the first hour, so I put it off for a long while. And then, as you can tell from the ranking, something magical must have happened. Well, one day I decided to give this game a proper chance, so I explored and found answers with what I was confused with, and I have to admit, it did make sense to what they were executing. And after digging around to understand what was going on, I pressed on with the story until I met Balthiera and Fran, and oh my gosh! When they revealed about the Gambit system about assigning priorities to your units, my curiosity exploded, and I was eager to see how much it lived up to its name. So for this entry, I'll start talking about the two things what made Final Fantasy XII my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time from this point after I learned the Gambit system. The first thing I noticed was its fluidity and how natural the game felt. For example, that the game didn't transition to a battle screen when you encountered an enemy, but instead that the overworld was the battle screen. I know it's not a big deal for most people, but for me it kept the immersion completely intact. It wasn't just the battle execution but also the Gambit system. It was an unmatched feeling of charm to watch your characters act of their own accord without your commands, because you're setting the natural pace for your characters to act through your own standards. You know how in Resident Evil 5 that Sheva is criticized for her bad AI? The game gets shattered with the immersion in that game because it's not what the player would have done. And because you can't customize her AI, you're constantly being reminded that the computer is making the mistakes and giving you the game overs because Sheva is not acting to your ideals. It's why bad AI is a huge killjoy in gaming. It's because they don't act to your standards that you can't control. With Final Fantasy XII in a fast-paced, fluid environment where a lot of commands need to be done at once at a consistent rate, the Gambit system is the best solid mechanic you could ever ask for to keep the game flowing with how you want your party members to behave. And that to me adds a godly amount of immersion to the game, not having to worry about it, because they're all acting exactly as you would, especially since there are no glitches or problems with the mechanic whatsoever from what I've seen. The second and final thing I want to talk about is what makes Final Fantasy XII to me the #1 game is the smorgasbord of experimentation and customization. Now I'm not going to lie, but Final Fantasy XII is one of the hardest games out there in trying to grasp what strategy works better than others. That's because this game drops you into this world like The Legend of Zelda from NES and says, figure it out yourself. Because of this, you have to branch out with your 6 characters and discover those strategies by trial and error. Now that sounds like I'm giving a complaint about it, but instead, that's the biggest compliment I could ever ask for from a Final Fantasy game, because it's like a Rubik's Cube puzzle, and I have a massive sweet spot for puzzles that are within my reach to solve, and I can't emphasize that enough. Do you know how many times I restarted Final Fantasy XII because of this? 4 times, with all the playthroughs ending early into the game. And this is because I happened to pick the wrong strategies and the wrong abilities to invest my characters in, so I had to start over with experimenting with something else on my next playthrough. And you know what? This made me the happiest Final Fantasy player alive because it wasn't unfair. The game wasn't teasing me or telling me I was a sore loser, but that it was politely telling me to pick up the puzzle from square one and try again with a new idea, just like a Rubik's Cube puzzle. Eventually, I mastered the game. I beat the main story, and then I completed the hunts, even having killed Yzmat, got 100 hours into it, and got a complete grasp on the learning curve. And it is honestly the most challenging and most fulfilling thing I have ever done in Final Fantasy. Ever. And for that, Final Fantasy XII is my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time.